All right, welcome to week 4, where we've been talking about foster care. For this week's lecture, I have a couple of goals. I do want to highlight some of the areas where I'd like to see us all thinking a little bit critically about foster care. But first, I do want to just kind of talk through the process of how a child comes into foster care, because I think the RCW included in the module, which speaks about shelter care hearings, is really dry and really kind of, if you tried to read the entire thing, it's long. It I think could probably be confusing if there's terms in there that you're not used to. And so I really just want to try to break it down pretty simply and definitely encourage folks to ask questions if you've got them. I haven't worked in DCYF, but I have many colleagues who have. So if there are questions about procedural things, any little nitty-gritty things about the department and about what this process looks like on the child welfare worker side, please feel free to let me know. Again, I have lots of coworkers who worked in the department prior to coming to Children's, and they would be happy to answer questions. So please send them if you've got them. You can put them in messages. You can put them in any of the discussions coming up. Please feel free. So where I want to start is kind of calling back to last week when we started talking about what it means for a child to be taken into protective custody. That is one of the ways that a child can come into foster care. So as a quick refresher, protective custody is when a law enforcement professional or a medical professional or system is of the opinion that a child is at risk of death or severe harm if left kind of in their current setting. A lot of times, this doesn't happen a ton on the medical side as far as I've seen it. It's really, really hard to make a case for that. So a lot of times when this is happening, it's happening because law enforcement's involved for whatever reason. Either a neighbor's concerned and called law enforcement, there's some sort of accident or emergency that necessitates law enforcement being called, or the fire department or an EMT is called and they have concerns and then call law enforcement as a result. That, I would say, happens much more commonly, again, than a child going into protective custody after being involved in the medical system. And again, that's just one way of kind of starting that clock for DCYF to come decide if they're going to accept the protective custody. And then at that point, they would have that 72 hours that the RCW references to kind of decide if they're as concerned as the person who initiated the PC is, or if they are not concerned enough to place that child into shelter care at that time. That, I would say, happens pretty infrequently. The standard for that is just so high, I think for good reason, as we've talked about with the 1227 legislation and the disproportionate impact of the foster care system in general on communities of color, poor communities, groups like that. And the burden is just very, very high. I think what's much more common is that DCYF or CPS becomes involved as the result of a concern. So maybe a teacher, a nurse, a social worker, someone calls in a concern that doesn't quite meet the threshold of a child needing to be removed in that moment, but is concerning enough that DCYF would kind of open an investigation and become involved in that family's life. During that period, they're investigating, they're getting to know the family, they're trying to put some supports in place, they're trying to do some permanency planning, some safety planning. Kind of as that process continues, as they're getting to know that family more, that whole time they can be deciding whether the things that they're putting in place are working or whether they need to petition for shelter care or dependency, which is essentially where they would be able to then place the child outside of that home. Those are sort of the two ways that kids can come into foster care. Again, The protective custody to shelter care route is much less common. The standard is really, really high. And I will say the standard of removing a child from their home at all is quite high, as we talked about last week. The 1227 legislation kind of upped that burden of proof and did raise the bar for what kind of safety concern needs to be present for a child to be removed from their family of origin. And we talked about this. It's good that we're thinking that way. It can also lead to children staying in really unsafe situations and unfortunately can lead to really devastating circumstances. And like we talked about last week, that pendulum swing just hasn't quite found its middle. And that's just something that, as long as I've been working in this field, and I'm sure for years to come, will continue to be an issue. That leads me into kind of the first point where I want us to really be thinking critically is this idea of weighing a child's safety now against the future impact of being involved in foster care as they get older. Obviously, no one in DCYF is psychic. No one has the ability to predict what the best outcome is going to be for this child and how we get there. And I think part of the goals of legislation like 1227 is likely to try to offset some of that lack of psychicness and try to offset some of the potential impact that removal can have on the future of a child and a future of a family. As you've seen in some of the writings from this module, removal of a child from their family of origin is intensely traumatic. It's traumatic for the child, it's traumatic for the family, it's traumatic for everyone involved, even if it is ultimately the safest choice. And I think it's important that we remember that we're not needing to choose either or. We're not choosing either this is a safe situation or it's a traumatic situation. It can absolutely be both. And even if a child is in a really, really terrible situation, it's still going to be completely disruptive, completely traumatizing to be pulled out of that situation and put somewhere else. Oftentimes, in the best case scenario, I guess most of the time in the best case scenario, a child is going to be placed with a family member or someone they already know. But even then, think about your own childhood. If you grew up in whatever constellation of a family you grew up in, all of a sudden to be pulled out of that and then sent to live with your aunt who lives 2 towns over and you've seen her at family reunions, but you don't really know her that well. That's still essentially a stranger. It's still an environment that isn't comfortable to you. It isn't known to you. And it's going to be traumatic. And so I think it's really easy. And I think there's a little bit of self-comfort in this. If we really want to get into it, I think it's easy to think that the safety of the child now outweighs the potential impact that removal and systems involvement has on the adult that child is going to become. And it's just not that simple. I highly encourage folks to review the material I included about aging out of foster care. I think that's an area where the resources are not great. And again, I've never worked for DCYF, so I don't know what this looks like on the practice side. However, I do know what it's like working with these teenagers, these young adults who are either aging out or have just aged out. I think their options don't always make sense to them. And if they're not kind of told the benefits of one choice versus the benefits of the other, they're at risk of losing out on a lot of resources just because they want to get out of this system, which is really understandable. And it's just really complicated. And unfortunately, we do see that kids who have been in foster care and who have aged out of foster care, so turned 18, while they are still technically independent of the state, are at risk for a lot of other things. Kind of in that same vein, in thinking about kids who either stay in foster care for a really long time or who don't have a lot of placement options, the next thing I kind of want us thinking critically about are some of the challenges that a specific child may face in terms of getting placed somewhere that's actually feels safe and feels beneficial for them. So I think teenagers are where I'll start. I think many of us can maybe understand that while taking care of like a baby or a toddler is probably a lot of work, as someone who doesn't know this child, the idea of bringing a 3-year-old into your home versus bringing a 15-year-old into your home may be a lot less daunting. Finding placement for teens is challenging, especially when teens come in kind of with this complicated psychosocial constellation of factors, which, at least in my work, is something we see a lot. It is not uncommon for kids to come into the emergency department and have to discharge to like a youth shelter because, you know, their family either isn't willing to come pick them up or isn't deemed a safe environment, but DCYF also can't find a foster placement that's willing to take a teenager who may have all this other stuff going on. And then we see that kind of follow through into that child potentially aging out of foster care, having never actually been in foster care in the traditional sense, never actually having had a placement with a family. And then either making the choice or not realizing that they have the choice to stay in those services, and then ultimately losing out on any additional support when they turn 18, and then all of a sudden they're an adult and they're out on their own. So that's one challenging area. Another challenging area in terms of finding placement for kids and finding stability for kids is when kids are medically or behaviorally or developmentally complex. So obviously in my work, I see this a lot on the medical side, but there's also lots of kids out there who have underlying mental health issues or mental health issues that were either caused or exacerbated by the trauma of their family of origin, who are then very, very, very hard to place and don't end up having great options. I can't speak to how this plays into making a decision about ultimately removing a child from a situation, but I do sometimes wonder if there's, you know, a child who would be harder to place if they were removed, if there are ever times where children stay in unsafe situations because DCYF worries that they wouldn't be able to find something safer. Again, I have nothing to back that up, but it's something that I've thought about in cases that I've worked before. And then the last area I'll highlight, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. I am sure there are so many other areas that we could dive into if we wanted to, but for the sake of time, I will just bring up one more, and that is language. And I think I will fully own some ignorance about how many languages there are and how many languages are spoken in a city that I think isn't super diverse appearing on the surface, but actually has a lot of little microcosms under all of that. Language is a huge potential barrier to accessing resources in general. There are so many resources out there that don't have access to language lines or will have things translated into maybe the top 3, the top 5 if we're lucky languages. But there are so many languages spoken in this city and surrounding areas, obviously across the world. But when we're thinking about DCYF, there are so many languages that these kids and families have the potential to be speaking. And for these rarer to Seattle languages, thinking about Marshallese, thinking about Mixteco Bajo, thinking about Mom, thinking about some of these languages that I personally had never heard of up until I started doing this work, it is very, very challenging to find culturally appropriate foster placements for a lot of these kids that are not a direct part of their family or their very small surrounding community. And when the goal is to keep a child close to home, this kind of has the potential to work out. However, there are going to be situations where maybe a family is really isolated. They're one of only a few people in their area who speak their language, and maybe everyone who speaks that language is in their family, and everyone in their family either can't pass a background check or isn't deemed a safe caregiver. And if there's no one else who speaks that language, that is just going to further isolate that child. It's going to make it harder for the family caring for that child and the family of origin to communicate with each other. And it can be a huge disservice to kids, to families of origins. And it's definitely something that can be a barrier to identifying a good placement for a child. And I was talking about language, but I think we can broaden that more to culture in general. I think when we talk about placement with families of a different race, a different religion, who speak a different language, I think there's a lot of potential challenges at hand there. And I think there's a lot of ways for kids to potentially not get everything that they actually need from a placement that's otherwise deemed safe. So I'm going to stop because I think I started rambling a little bit there at the end. So thanks for staying with me. I want you to continue to try to think critically. Again, I know some of the procedural parts of this are pretty dry, but my bigger goals for you all as we're learning together are to really think critically and to kind of think about some of these broader systemic issues and how they can impact these kids. So take a look at the rest of the module. I'm excited to see your answers to the quiz this week. I'll be responding back to you directly in the quiz, and I'm excited to see what you have to say.